The ruins of St. Clair's army flooded into Fort Jefferson the following day. There they met Major Hamtramck and the rest of the 1st U.S. Infantry. They had heard the gunfire and had advanced toward the scene of action, but had retreated upon receiving word of catastrophe. St. Clair's adrenaline had dissolved. His gout overtook him. It was obvious what his final course of action would be. By November 8th, the army was back in Fort Washington. Chaos erupted in neighboring Cincinnati as traumatized soldiers scoured for supplies and relief. The officers and men seemed to have lost all consideration for military propriety and service. All relation between officers and men forgot, and not even the semblance of duty acknowledged for the public. Great excesses were committed in the town, and nothing more devoutly to be wished for than that we were fairly rid of them. In justice, however, it must be observed that there were officers whose exertions were not wanting to correct abuses, and others only prevented from advising them by wounds and inability. The day and the whole army were distressed for the want of clothing, blankets, camp equipage, and this at a season when there was most essentially necessary. The situation indeed was truly distressing. It could only be justly conceived of by experiencing it. As anarchy reigned around Fort Washington, St. Clair struggled through his own agony to try and explain to the rest of the country what had befallen his army. Yesterday afternoon, the remains of the army under my command got back to this place, and I have now the painful task to give you an account of as warm and unfortunate an action as almost any that has been fought in which every corps was engaged or worst. I have not yet been able to get the returns of the killed and wounded, but Major General Butler, Lieutenant Colonel Oldman in the militia, Major Ferguson, Major Hart, and Major Clark are among the former. Colonel Sargent, my Adjutant General, Lieutenant Colonel Dark, Lieutenant Colonel Gibson, Major Butler, and the Viscount Malarty, who served me as an aide-de-camp among the latter, and a great number of captains and subalterns in both. I have now, sir, finished my melancholy tale. A tale that will be felt sensibly by every one that has sympathy for private distress or for public misfortune. The loss, sir, the public has sustained, but the fall of so many officers, particularly General Butler and Major Ferguson, cannot be too much regretted. But it is a circumstance that will alleviate the misfortune of some misery that all of them fell most gallantly doing their duty. St. Clair entrusted a copy of the report with Denny, who made haste to Philadelphia. But by the time he had arrived in the capital on December 19th, the news was already known to the nation. St. Clair's defeat was a disaster President Washington could ill afford. The enormous costs in both hard goods and lives was too much for some Americans to cope. Newspapers ran editorials questioning the true motivations behind the war with the Northwest Confederacy. Others feared that raids would soon plague the western frontier in a severity never before seen. Someone had to be blamed for ruining the only defense the federal government had against the Confederacy. St. Clair firmly defended the bravery of the officers and soldiers he commanded on November 4th. Yet he only could suggest the cause of disaster be a general lack of discipline. In December, he arrived in Philadelphia seeking a court-martial be authorized by Henry Knox and President Washington. But with a lack of officers similar to rank to St. Clair, Washington claimed a fair court-martial was not possible. St. Clair's only option was to resign from the United States Army. This did not appease the nation. The following spring, Congress agreed to organize a special committee of House members to investigate the cause of St. Clair's defeat, the first congressional investigation under the Constitution. Amongst those who testified against St. Clair was William Dark. Although he had survived the battle, his son had died of wounds received on November 4th. In a fury of grief, Dark made a public letter decrying St. Clair's command of the campaign. Ultimately, the committee absolved St. Clair of any wrongdoing. In a 100-page report, the committee concluded the cause of the disaster came down to a delay in supplies, mismanagement by the quartermaster, and lack of experience amongst the soldiers. It would not be until February of 1793 that the investigations would wrap up. As politicians squabbled in Philadelphia, the Northwest Territory remained disputed land. The victory against St. Clair's army was not as unifying for the Confederacy as Little Turtle may have hoped. Several leaders were content with their victory and returned to their homes shortly after. A lack of aggression the following 2 summers from the federal government made many more warriors complacent. It would not be until 1794 that the United States returned to the region. Lessons had been learned as elements of General Anthony Wayne's Legion constructed a fortification upon the very ground St. Clair was defeated on. In a second battle along the Wabash, the few hundred American soldiers within the walls of Fort Recovery held off 1,000 Confederacy warriors. Later that summer, Wayne defeated the Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Little Turtle was convinced to surrender and agreed to the terms of the Treaty of Greenville soon after. William Wells influenced that decision. His bravery at St. Clair's defeat impressed Little Turtle enough to welcome him among the Miami, even allowing Wells to marry his daughter. The treaty solidified much of the Northwest Territory as the state of Ohio. Little Turtle became celebrated by the United States, coming to be seen as the ultimate leader of the Confederacy that had handed the country its worst military defeat. But his part in the treaty infuriated several of the tribes in the Confederacy, as they had no say in losing their ancestral lands. History would repeat itself in the 19th century as a new war erupted between the United States and another Confederacy, this one led by a Shawnee, who had been a young warrior fighting along the banks of the Wabash on November 4, 1791. That Shawnee would be remembered forever as Tecumseh.